Everyone, it's Cricket Barrientos with Spectrum Talks and Tips, and I'm here today with Samuel J. Levine. He's in New York, and he is a law professor. And I'm going to let him share the rest of his title because he has a lot of things he's working on, but you're going to be really excited. This is a great resource to have with Sounds of Autism and the community that we serve. So thank you, Sam, for being on here, Samuel, for being on here today with me. And I'd like you to share just a little bit about your background because you've done some really amazing things, and I think everybody would love to hear that.
Thank you so much, Cricket, and it's such a pleasure and an honor to participate in your programming. And feel free to call me Sam, please. That's
Okay.
terrific. And as you mentioned, I'm a law professor. My title is Professor of Law and Director of the Jewish Law Institute at Touro Law Center, Touro, Touro Law Center in Long Island in New York, as you mentioned. And as part of my role at Touro, a number of years ago, I initiated the Disability Rights and Inclusion Project, which speaks very much to the issues regarding autism, advocating acceptance, awareness, inclusion for individuals on the autism spectrum.
Wow, that's great. And I did a little research on you, and I saw that you went to was it University of Michigan or Michigan State?
So I taught at Michigan State University a summer course actually on Jewish law. I was a distinguished visiting professor one summer, and it was a terrific experience. Did you have a connection to MSU? Or?
If I tell you, you're gonna laugh, but yes. So my dad was a teacher. He was a music teacher, and we grew up in Manistee, Michigan, which is way up there. And when we were there, he was a U of M,
Mm.
University of Michigan fan. So we all had those like sweaters and things like that. Fast forward, we have my mom's now engaged to a man who likes Michigan State. So there's a little of that, and then my husband is a Notre Dame fan, so there's a lot of yeah, you understand.
So
We
you wear
all
the blue or the green or the, yeah.
so I told him I'll never change. That was my dad's team, and he's no longer with us. But yeah, so Sounds of Autism, it has really come from my music background as well as the voice, bringing a voice to autism. So it's exciting, and that's why we love reaching out to people and meeting people like yourselves because your knowledge is so beneficial. Because as you know, as a parent or an individual that supports people with any disability, there's not a lot of books written on how to go about this journey, and it's very different than typical life. And I highly suggest that people really start learning about it, because it's, I think now 8-year-old children is what they took as a data point, but 1 in 30 8-year-old children in the United States have autism. When I came here in 2006, it was like 1 in 186. Like, it's growing so rapidly. And some people say, okay, it's awareness. But other people say there's something going on, whether it's environmental or whatever it may be. And, I don't focus on why, because I think we would just go crazy if we did. I focus on how do we live with a population that's completely their thoughts are completely different than the way we think, but they're the most compassionate and empathetic people I've ever met. And they're docile and very highly intelligent, like to a point where when you realize that your role, my role, is to take and do whatever we can to get that fullest potential out of them, because these are your next scientists, these are your next inventors, these are the people, technology, these are people that are going to take us to a whole nother level in life if we just really allow them to be a part of our culture. Yes, in society. So I appreciate what you do. And you won, actually, speaking of Notre Dame, you won an award, I believe, right? Can you share a little bit about that?
Well, I have had connections with Notre Dame. I've spoken there, a number of times, and I have some friends, colleagues on the faculty there who have been very kind to me in their praise for my work and recognition of the scholarship that I've done over the years. Mhm.
Oh, that's awesome. Good job. And then tell me about, you said that you're a professor at the Touro. Am I saying that right? Yep.
Touro.
Touro University. Tell me a little bit about your, just every day. Who are you teaching? What are their focus areas? How does all that work? Because a lot of times I know students are going to college, and especially with law. I come from Loyola University in Chicago, and we had a lot of people that moved on to law. And it's just fascinating to me, the minds that go in that direction. So I would love to know, tell us a little bit about your students and just how that all works for you every day.
Sure, thank you. And I do have friends on the Loyola Chicago Law
Oh,
School
oh,
faculty as
perfect.
well. There's actually a bunch of Loyolas, as you well know. And there's a Loyola Law School out in LA where I lived for a number of years. There's a Loyola Law School in New Orleans, as it turns out. And I think they're kind of loosely affiliated. There's a
Yeah.
Loyola University in Maryland, which I've spoken at as well. So I'm well familiar with different Loyolas. A law professor teaches students in the United States who have graduated college. It's an advanced degree, a graduate degree. So students who sometimes come straight from college, sometimes have worked in between, sometimes have worked or raised a family for a number of years and then return to school. Many of our students, or some of our students, are working at the time that they're in law school as well. There's a general curriculum where students learn the core legal system in the United States. So I teach, for example, criminal law as part of that core curriculum. Students learn torts, contracts, property, all those fun courses, interesting topics related to different aspects of our legal system. Students also take advanced topics, electives sometimes, given their particular area of interest, their specialty, where they may want to pursue. So I sometimes teach advanced criminal law topics for students who are interested, as I was many years ago, a prosecutor, or if they're interested in becoming a criminal defense attorney. There are advanced courses in a variety of different areas and different legal fields. At Touro, as I mentioned, we've initiated and we take very seriously our dedication to disability rights and inclusion. So for example, in terms of my students, and it all starts from the students, a few years ago, a student in my class who told me he was aware of my advocacy for disability rights and inclusion, and he told me that he has a brother who's Down syndrome, and his family has established a foundation, an organization, and he himself has for 20 some years advocated, worked with, and lived with his brother. And he wanted to do something more. So we established a chapter of what's called DALSA, the Disabled and Allied Law Students Association. It's a loosely affiliated national organization, and it has chapters at different law schools across the country. So now he's the president of our Touro Law School, DALSA, and we recruited students from the law school, and we're trying to bring that sense of awareness, of understanding, of familiarity. Because to your point regarding autism, I think one of the biggest challenges we have to inclusion and acceptance is that lack of understanding, the lack of familiarity, really ignorance, we would call it. And you mentioned potential and supports and individuals, and I'm a proponent of the saying. It's been attributed to a number of people that if you've met one person on the autism spectrum, you've met one person on the autism spectrum. And there are many of our students who I think they all have met someone on the autism spectrum based on the numbers that you mentioned that I think are quite accurate, to say the least, but they may not realize it. So they may think they've never met someone who's autistic. And if they have, they didn't think twice about it. And I think that's really the first step. So one of the functions and goals of DALSA, and one of the functions and goals of the Disability Rights and Inclusion Project, is to have programming, is to have events where another concept that I'm a proponent of is nothing about us without us. So we will have individuals on the autism spectrum as part of the programming speaking for themselves. So it's not just us talking about them, it's people speaking for themselves. And I think that also is a very effective way of informing and educating people.
I love it. I'm going to tell you, so a couple things. First, we have 4 phases in our program. The first phase, we call it survival phase, and it actually is all college students, all different levels. We have everything from associate and bachelor's degree students to people that have master's degree, and then we get to the occupational therapy doctoral programs, any kind of doctoral program. It could be law, it could be anything. And the doctoral program, we actually work with them on creating all kinds of different tools and programs and things that would be very beneficial to integrate individuals with disabilities back into society, specifically autism, because we say that a lot of times you have to build that educational curriculum or the idea, sometimes to a very step-by-step mentality, just because of the literal thinking and the processing delays and all the things that kind of go along with autism. And so, I learned this because I started writing some educational curriculum, and I'll tell you something, I threw it in the garbage. I started writing it, and I did it, and it was based off of Bloom taxonomy. And Bloom taxonomy is an educational curriculum guide that individuals use to basically create educational curriculum for the K through 12. And in there, the highest level in their business model is creating. And so many years ago in the restaurant industry, 1997, I saw that Tiger Woods actually won the green jacket. He was the youngest African American to do that, and he was very successful and very methodical and strategic the way he did things. And all of a sudden, like a week later, after he wins this green jacket, being the youngest African American to win that and being such a successful master of his game, he gets LASIK eye surgery and he decides to change the way he's going to grip the golf club. And I go, why would anybody do that? It's like Michael Jordan. Why would you change anything? If it's working for you, continue doing that, right? But then I thought about it. I stepped back and I said, well, if you're the master of something, who's your competition? And I said, it's yourself. You have to keep doing self-improvement because eventually somebody's going to figure out how to rise to your level, and then you're going to have to compete with them. And as we get older, it's harder. So I created this model, and it's basically a 21 to 28 days creating a habit, and it goes up the scale as the student, down the scale as the teacher, and then every level, we have 3 tiers, is conditioning and muscle memory and just all those things that come along with it. But it also talks about hurdles, obstacles, and viruses and different things that kind of pull you away from actually meeting the goal. And when I created this, I started applying it later into my nonprofit world, and now it's called Creating Signature Empowerment. And creating is the first level of once we can get individuals, especially with those that have the ability to create, but there's so many things blocking that creativity, how to cope with the triggers and the OCD and the sensory and the ADHD and all these things that are coming at individuals with these types of disabilities, I guess we could call it, um, it doesn't fit into typical life. And so that's phase 1. But when I got to phase 3, I actually got to coach and start coaching all of these adults with disabilities in a warehouse. And we do life, job, and safety skill training. And all of these individuals, most of them probably won't work a full-time job because they all get Social Security or some type of benefit, but they're not so low function that they can't do it on their own. They just can't do it maybe without a partner or somebody that's going to kind of support them. And so I created something called a survival team, and I'm really looking at these individuals saying, okay, they get along really well. I think they have very like-minded thoughts, and the way that they work together, they like hanging out with one another, and they start kind of building their own survival team. So as we're doing this, I threw the curriculum away because I realized that the way to teach that I have found to get to the highest level quickly is to be able to, on your feet quickly, modify the education. And it just depends on the individual. Like you said, when you see one person with autism, you see one person with autism. That is a huge, huge clue as to how you're going to have to educate these individuals. And with our society today and the way that the educational system works, people struggle to modify anything. And the reason I know that is because we were doing a high risk stop with one of our good police departments, Goodyear Police Department. We were doing a training session. Every individual in the car that was being pulled over had autism. but all different levels. I mean, one kid that was on there, he's now working cybersecurity. He's very intelligent. The other kid, he's going to college and getting a degree. The other kid is, home working with his sister on a nonprofit. And then the other individual is my son. When they were trying to take my son out of the car and giving him the commands as officers, everybody was stressed out already because things were just, it was very difficult. The officers were struggling to get these kids to comply with things. They didn't know how to modify their language. And so they were doing these things, and as they're going through their commands, they're just reading it like from their academy years. They're just reading it out of their minds, like the way they learned it step by step. But they're going so fast that I'm watching my son as they're going through the commands. They're on command like number 3, and he's not even command number 1 yet. So I'm watching this and I'm like, okay, if we had to modify what we just said there to get him to comply, how would we modify that language? And I think that's a big part of this is there's so many kids in a classroom. The teachers, you have to modify for 32 kids. That's very difficult at times. And so anyway, I'm in the warehouse now and I'm teaching these individuals, and we're getting to a level where now their independent thoughts are happening. Because for the first 6 months, I had actually unconditioned them because every one of them had gone through either speech therapy, OT, or PT, or all three. And the only way they would do things is if they looked at me for confirmation that it was okay to do something. So they didn't have one independent thought. And I'm like, oh my gosh, where now today they're actually correcting the next group of individuals coming in because they realize, like, no, you're supposed to just do that. And so I learned the model. I think it's successful, creating signature empowerment, but I turned it over to these individuals and now they're leading it to teach.
Wow. So you raised so many important issues and a lot of areas that really are core to the work of the Disability Rights and Inclusion Project, at Touro, and to my own interests. So just starting with education, we are a law school. So education is our most basic mission, educating our own students and training our students to be lawyers, but also training our students to work in areas such as special education. And so when we started the Disability Rights and Inclusion Program a number of years ago, our first programming was directed at special education. We had lawyers, we had therapists talking about the IEP process. And as you point out, supposedly, it should be, the law requires that an IEP be individualized. But, we all know, anyone who's been involved in these efforts is quite familiar. And as a law professor, I hate to say it, but we have to recognize that there is a law on the books. There's the way the law is supposed to work and the way the law works or sometimes doesn't work in real life. And unfortunately, when it comes to special education, that's one of the areas that the law does not live up, that real life does not live up to the requirements of the law. But yes, IEP, individualized, because every individual is different. And we as a society have recognized, at least on paper, at least through our legal system, we have federal and state laws that do mandate providing an education to every student, a free and appropriate public education for every student. And we clearly haven't reached those goals at this point, but we keep trying. And for example, in addition to our programming, we do have courses in special education. We have a special education clinic at the law school. And I know that you're involved in different communities and trying to bring out resources and advice for individuals, because the reality is, as a society, we marginalize individuals with disabilities and we marginalize their families as well. And where does someone turn to? So just one thought for your audience is that there are law school clinics. For example, we mentioned Chicago, Loyola Chicago. They have a special education clinic, from what I understand. And there are law school clinics, there are public service law firms, there are organizations that are out there. And I strongly recommend reaching out, because there are people that do want to help and do want to provide those services and supports. And without those supports, it's just so difficult to navigate the system, the bureaucracy, and all of the opposition that comes from, of all things, the school system. where parents are trying to get the services that they deserve, that they require under the law, and of all things, have to fight for the children and have to fight for the schools to actually comply with their legal obligations. The second point you raised, and the fascinating story about the police officers and your particular case, your son's experiences. I mentioned that I teach criminal law. I was a prosecutor. And there's a phrase that's used sometimes, criminalizing disability or criminalizing autism. And it's not an overstatement to say, tragically, there have been not a few instances where individuals with disabilities have been mistreated or worse by law enforcement. And it often is a result of ignorance. It often is a result of not being familiar, of lack of awareness. And that's another reason why it's so important to bring out that sense of awareness, to train. And I know there are efforts being made to train law enforcement to understand what it is that they're seeing, to understand what it is they're looking at, that the individual is not being defiant. They're not being non-compliant because they're trying to resist. They're acting in a way that is natural for them, that's not typical, so to speak, for the rest of us, as it were, or for what the officer is familiar with. But that training and that familiarity can make all the difference between dealing with the situation properly and, unfortunately, the opposite, which, as I mentioned, does happen all too frequently. Another area that you raised was employment. And I think disability employment is yet another area where we've focused. We've actually conducted a number of webinars highlighting and featuring disability and autism employment programs. And I think the reason autism employment is so important is that I mentioned, and I think we all know, those who are involved in these efforts, the educational system is not what it should be. But on the other hand, I think we can at least recognize that we are familiar with, and the schools at least know that they do have these obligations, that there are federal laws on the books, there are protections in place, and we're getting there. We're not there yet, but I think we are getting there, and we have made great progress in the special educational system and providing special education advocacy. Once a student ages out, whether they graduate high school or they turn 21, they age out of the system, those legal obligations and those supports and structures are no longer in place. And the next step, the transitional step, is what I think as a society we're really facing. And we are here too behind the curve in responding to the needs of transition, the needs of whether it's independent living that you alluded to, the needs of employment. And once again, every individual is different. And in the autism employment programs I've observed and studied, there's a wide range of different methods and different strategies, but they all turn on and focus on the individual and what this individual needs, and to help them reach their potential. And sometimes that potential is to be a rocket scientist, and sometimes that potential is to fold laundry, and whatever that job may be. The experience I've seen, and it's not uniform, we can't overstate, we can't generalize too much, we can't stereotype, but the experience that I've seen in so many of these programs is that with the proper supports and the proper attitude from the employee does the job, and the employee does the job well, and in a way that's a real benefit to the company.
Thank you for saying all that, because I agree with you on all of those things. And I'm going to share with you something that I learned, a couple of things that I learned with working with these individuals that are adults. And everybody is either 18 all the way up to 26 years old at this time. 1 female to 7 boys. Because we know that there's a distinction between the two. And I think they say females with autism tend to mask a little bit better. So it's hard to diagnose, where the males are, more willing to share those things. When we work in the warehouse, our jobs are everything from sorting boxes to counting items to lifting to working on ladders and trying to lift boxes up there. We're working on mobile skills. We're working on physical skills. We're working on speech and how do you, we have team builders where companies come in and the boys are conducting the entire team builder. They're talking about it and they include themselves in some of the critical stages of the team builder so that they can see the processing delays and the different things that they would struggle with if they were in the corporate world or if they were in the just in a typical job. And I noticed that at 45 minutes of a task, that if I say take a break for 15 minutes ish, each of these individuals go off in their area and they stim.
Hmm.
They pace, they listen to their music, they flap their arms, they're doing all this stuff. And people ask me when they're in the warehouse, they ask like, what are they doing right now? And I said, well, all these boys have a very big gift. It's called self-regulation, and I'm like, and they are basically taking the information that we just talked about or we just conducted, and in my opinion, they're compartmentalizing what's important, and they put it in this area, and the stuff that's not important, they're removing it, or maybe it still stays there. I don't know, but I'm just guessing that they're finding a way to take all that information so that their sensory comes back down to a typical thought. And when we go back to another task, they're capable of now doing that task because they don't have all this information. I said, but when I don't give them the stimming time and we go from task to task to task, by the time we get to the third task, every one of them's ready to go home. They're done. And I go, and they're very much like clockwork. Like when you say we're done at 1 o'clock, you better be done at 1 o'clock because they're telling you, hey, it's 12:55, And I said, I love this, but this is the reason that I bring the community into their environment because they're very comfortable in this environment, even though it's not their environment, because they've made it their environment. And when we have the credit unions coming in or the Anderson windows or whoever it might be, these boys are already comfortable and they're empowered, right? Creating signature empowerment. They're empowered because they have been doing this task 6 months. So now these individuals come in that they would probably look at it as like, oh, they work and their level is high compared to these people because this is a brand new task and they start realizing they're telling them, don't worry, it's okay, I'm here to help you, and all of those things that we had to do right to get to this level, they're now bringing compassion and empathy for the public. And I love it because we've reversed that thought, right? We've reversed those thinkings. And a lot of times, as I said, the independent thought or the literal thinking doesn't always translate over. And so I'll give you an example. We have a washer and a dryer at our home here. We have another home in Chicago. When we went to Chicago, I asked my son to do the laundry, and he said, I don't know how. And I said, why don't you know how? Well, because that's a different, we're in a different house and I don't understand. I said, Landon, it's the exact same washer and dryer. No, mom, I don't know how. So we walked down to the basement. We always do tell, show, do, review. So I told him, I showed him, we did it, and then we talked about it. And he goes, oh, this is just like my house. And I said, yes. But I took for granted that just because it was here in this home, and now we go to Chicago and now we're doing the same thing, that he would just translate that information over. But it was ironic. So I said, okay, going back to these job programs that you're speaking about, that little piece of information now shows when you transition from the job coaching area to now you're going into a real job. If you just allow that person to go take that job and you're not transitioning them correctly, they will not translate many times that information you just taught them over to this job. And now that person that you saw that does all these successful things is failing at something that we actually allowed them to fail at because we didn't transition correctly. Does that make sense?
I think that makes a lot of sense. And, certainly there's a part of autism that from everything we know, and I try to learn as much as I can from individuals on the autism spectrum. It's their lived experience that tells us, I think, the most about what it's like. And I think there is a big part of a need, a desire for structure, for consistency. We call that sometimes in kind of negative sense inflexibility, but I think in more positive sense, wanting consistency. And when there are these transitions, when there is this sense of trying to generalize from one situation to another, there are sometimes challenges there. I also have found, and this is speculation on my part, I think on all our parts, but so many individuals on the autism spectrum are hesitant to kind of step out of a situation because their whole lives they've been told that they're doing things wrong.
Yeah.
And to your point about that experience, can I do this? Is it okay? Because they've been told in so many different instances, you can't do that. And not because they were doing anything wrong, just because they were doing something different. And if you're told over and over and over, your way of thinking is wrong, even though there's nothing about it that's less valid than a typical way of thinking, then that's going to have an impact on someone's psyche. That's going to have an impact on the way someone sees themselves. And they may be hesitant and reluctant and nervous. What if I do try something that's outside my comfort zone, but it seems right to me? And why is everyone else telling me it's not right? So I think that's something that we really do have to address from the younger ages so that we do instill that sense of empowerment that you're talking about, that sense of confidence, so that when individuals are now in school, when individuals are at their workplace, they don't have that sense of dread, that sense of, oh no, what if I do something wrong? And I want to make the point when it comes to autism employment or any other form of employment, really. You mentioned the giving a break for stimming, for example. And there are employers who are very resistant to hiring individuals with disabilities because they say, well, I can't make these accommodations. I can't make these adjustments for someone. I can't treat them differently. And they make all kinds of excuses. And my response is often, I get it. And, I recognize that for many business people, for many bosses, the goal is, and the one interest is to keep the business going, the profit motive, and that's understandable. Um, and I think actually, rather than focusing or proposing what we sometimes call, the charity model, oh, come on, do something good. It's for the good of the community. It's for the good of this person. You're being nice. That really backfires in my experience in most instances, because it's really what I refer to as a lose-lose, because the employer's hiring someone because they feel like they have to. And the person getting the job senses they're attuned to that. They realize that no one really wants them there, that they're sort of patting them on the back. Sure, we will allow you to be part of our atmosphere, part of our setting, but you're not really among us. We're not real. That's not real inclusion. And the win-win is for employers to recognize, what can this candidate bring to the table? And again, it could be that this person's a computer whiz, that they can code like no one else, that they can just understand technology at such an advanced level, or it can be that you need someone, and you mentioned your background, in restaurants, and I think in the hospitality industry in particular, there's been a recognition that you need someone who's going to serve the customers with a smile consistently, not take a 3-hour lunch, not be nasty to the customers because they don't like the way they're doing something, not try to backbite and second guess and somehow climb the ladder at someone else's expense. And again, without overgeneralizing, that is what we see in so many cases when it comes to autism employment, that the employee appreciates the opportunity they're getting, and they do their job, and they do it well with a smile, and that connection, that striving for structure actually plays to the advantage of the employer. Because if you tell an employee who's on the autism spectrum, okay, as you said, the hours are from 9 to 1, you're working, you've got a 1-hour lunch from 1 to 2, you got to be back at 2, and then continue your job. More often than not, typically speaking, that individual will comply with those instructions. And we've all been in those workplaces where everyone's just trying to take unfair advantage. Everybody's trying to think what's in it for me, and they're really not dedicated to their job. And just one more point in terms of accommodations.
That's good.
And, I think employers, if they step back and think about it, they realize that they make all kinds of accommodations for all kinds of employees. I've been in the workplaces, and I'm sure you have as well, that are, not the happiest, not the friendliest, you might call them toxic. And you have people working there that you kind of scratch your head and you say, why are they still here? They're so problematic. They're bad mouthing everyone else. They're taking those 3-hour lunches. They're cutting corners. They're blaming other people for things. And sometimes the response from the boss is, well, you know what? That's okay with me because they're just terrific at what they're doing. And you think about it, so you're willing to accommodate someone who's nasty. You're willing to accommodate someone who's making trouble, and intentionally so. You're willing to make all those accommodations because the person can do their job. So I think you can accommodate giving someone a break to do some stimming so they can come back to their job. I don't think that's, expecting too much. And again, the employer will find that that's the case for the most part, that they really are benefiting. And, if anything, it's a win-win.
Well, and I think if, I see when the boys come home and they didn't have a lot of that time, their stress level is just so high, and then they're agitated, they're frustrated, they're difficult to, get along with. And I'm like, could you imagine if they had to do this 5 days a week, 40 hours a week? That would be a lot, and it would be very overwhelming. And I think that the employers that don't know that that needs to happen, where they give them that little bit of time, I call it a cigarette break, right? Back in the day when you had people that smoked, they would say, hey, can I go take a cigarette break? And you're like, okay, the people that don't smoke, they're just continuing to work while these other people are getting that break. You said it, there's accommodations being made. And everybody should have that little bit of a break, especially when it comes to like our first responders and stuff like that. They need that, right? Because if they keep going to the next thing, to the next thing, and next thing, and there's no de-escalation time, there's no time to just kind of woosah, I got to get this out of me, to go to the next thing. Now you're going, okay, maybe this is why we have PTSD with a lot of our first responders. And maybe this is why people are, suicides up and all of that kind of stuff, because people don't have that time. They don't know how to make that time, for themselves. And to be honest, I think that individuals that have these disabilities, especially that have been through the therapies, they're actually better at de-escalating stress and anxiety. They're better at that because they've been taught how to do that for pretty much their whole lives. The issue is, are they being allowed to do that? Is that something that, we have identified? And I think, the IEP in a workplace is probably another step that, I wish for. And I say that, not that it has to be so regulated, because I know that I talk to these teachers that have to do IEPs, and it's just a lot of work. I mean, they really haven't upgraded the system for 30 years, It really needs to be something that, okay, this person has a modified need and we can accommodate that. And it should be something that we talk about before the interview process. And if they're not allowed to accommodate it, or they can't accommodate it, does it comply with the law for the reason of their purpose of not complying? Because if the answer is no, then guess what? It forces you as a business owner. I know time is money, I get it, but you have to comply. Like, that's part of the issue here, is we're not doing that. And if you went in and you started really breaking it down into these, especially any sector, it doesn't matter if it's private, governmental, whatever, people only do what they know. And I don't think, unless you have a reason to learn about disability law, I don't think people just sit there and study it all day long. They learn it because they made a mistake and now they're in court.
I think that's exactly right. And, when it comes to employers, there are laws. They're not quite as strict or as regulated as the educational system. But the reality is that if someone wants to discriminate, they'll find a way to discriminate. And I think we should call it discrimination. We should call it civil rights. We should call it social justice, because that's what it is. And there are many other areas where we as a society have recognized and tried to put into place. And at the same time, we know that there's only so much the law can do. that we've had civil rights laws, for decades, for
Decades.
generations,
Yeah.
and we're not there yet either in other areas of discrimination. So it really is that social awareness. It really is, as you said, educating people, letting them understand something that if they haven't been through it themselves, if they haven't made that effort, and why would they? They're
Yeah.
busy. They're doing
Yeah.
what they have to do. And if there's not something that's going to drive them to open their eyes, to understand what's out there, then they are not necessarily going to do it on their own initiative. I would recommend, in terms of employment too, although the resources are more limited, there are more and more organizations out there. And for your audience as well, if they're looking into employment, there are organizations that do serve either as employment coaches. They try to work with both the applicant and the employer, try to facilitate, for example, the interview process.
Yeah.
And as I'm sure you know, but and you may not know, the interview process is one of the greatest barriers to entry for individuals
Yeah.
on the autism spectrum, because the interview is all about playing games.
Yeah.
It's all about not saying what you mean. It's about saying things that not quite to be true, and the person asking you the question knows is not quite true, but you say it in the right way. And again, without overgeneralizing, autism is often characterized by saying exactly what is true, but saying it in the wrong way in terms of the way typical society
Yes.
expect someone to communicate and express themselves. So that's just often an area where someone, interviews, they're on the autism spectrum, and they get that question, what are some of your biggest faults? And when you're supposed to say, oh, I'm an overachiever, I work too hard, I'm a perfectionist, instead they'll say things like, oh, well, here's my faults. Here's what I do wrong. And they think that they're going to be rewarded for it. And instead, they've just really
It's
doomed
the
their
opposite. Yes. Oh
education.
my gosh. You know what? Great point. And Samuel, I know we're running out of time here, but I wanted to just take a moment to say thank you for, coming on and talking about so many topics. I mean, our families are always looking for just some type of encouragement to try new things with their children, and especially when they get to an adult age, and just knowing that somebody like yourself is out there fighting for this, and educating our next generation to be prepared for this is so important to us. And that's really why we chose to work with college students as well, and we're even in the high school level now. Is we know that trying to find the compassion and empathetic stages of everybody's lives before they get into the real world is probably the best way to enter the real world, right? And go into that adult life, because now it's not something, it's just a natural reaction, and I think that's really what we're trying to accomplish here. So great job on everything you're doing, and I hope we can do this again. I'd love to have you come back and do it again with us. We have lots we could talk about, I'm sure. But we filled, oh my gosh, an hour, I think, and we still have a million things we haven't even talked about. So thank you for coming on today, and I look forward to us doing this again.
Well, thank you, Cricket. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Perfect. Good job.
Thank you, you too.
It's so easy, right?
Yeah.